everyone! Welcome to another video. This one's going to be a little bit different. Today I'm actually going over the basics of how to use watercolours. Well, you're not here for an intro, so let's get straight into it, shall we? How to care for your paints. There are two types of watercolour paints. There are tube paints and there are pan paints. Pan paints are basically the same as tube ones, however, they have been dried into little pans. These are the ones I'll be using and talking about today. These paints break down in water, which is what allows us to use them. By adding water, we can manipulate the colour. I will be making more in-depth video on how to do this and the basics of colour theory, but for today, let's look at the paints themselves. An important thing to remember in using these paints is that they are not acrylic paints. I heavily discourage mixing these paints to the point where they're a similar texture to acrylic, when they're a bit like a putty. It defeats the purpose of these paints and wastes a lot of product. All you really need is a bit of water on a mixing plate and to dip your brush into the pans to pick up pigment. I also discourage directly mixing colours in the pans themselves. While it doesn't ruin the paints per se, it does muddy them and you'll have to wash the palette to get the bright colours again. Yes, you can wash them carefully, but I advise not letting it get to that point. A very important part of watercolour is the type of paper you use. Why is paper so important, I hear you ask? Well, paper is important because the watercolour uses, well, you guessed it, water. Printed paper can't even handle a little bit of water. It weakens, warps, and tears, and can ruin a good painting. What's needed is a paper that's thick enough to hold onto water. I know it can be overwhelming to choose what sort of paper to use for painting. Hot press, cold press, cotton, there's a lot of options out there. Some paper have a lot of texture, which will show up in your painting, and others are quite smooth. My personal preference is a white paper with smooth texture, however it's entirely up to you to decide. You should do your own research and decide on what fits you best. Oh, and as a side note, don't let it stop you painting in your sketchbook. Some sketchbook papers are decent enough to where they can actually handle just a little bit of watercolour. So if you wanted to practice some studies but not take anything seriously, it's a-okay. This sketchbook you're seeing is a very cheap one that I have. I paid about £5 for it. It handles water just fine. Next, let's talk brushes. You don't need anything too fancy, just a soft brush, plenty of flex to it. While some brushes are softer than others, my preference are these cheap ones I bought from the works here in the UK. I find I return to these in addition to using my large calligraphy brush. My favourite of these brushes are the small round ones. The bristles are just the right length for me personally, and I like to use them with flat brushes for adding details, along with a pinstripe brush for making longer lines and even smaller details. I like to use my calligraphy brush for doing wide washes on larger pieces, but I can get really thin lines with it as well if I wanted to. It's a really versatile brush if you just want one brush, but it is a little bit more difficult to control. Now I am going to show you some simple mark making techniques. These are the base ones for understanding how watercolour functions. Here I will teach you wet on wet, wet on dry, and layering, as well as brush marks, flat colour washes, and a gradient. The first thing I do for the wet on wet technique is to wet the page. We want it to be a rather thin layer of water and not sopping wet, so just a couple passes with a clean brush will wet the area. You could also use a spray bottle for larger surfaces if you're working big. Next, I'll take some colour from the pan and place it on the wet patch. Keep in mind that the colour will go pretty much wherever it pleases. You can see how the colour is spreading from the point we placed it in. We can use the brush to push it along to help guide the colour we want it. I like to use this effect at the start of paintings, but you can use it anytime really. The wet on dry technique is probably one of the simplest ones. All you have to do is, with a wet brush, pick up a bit of pigment and paint directly on a dry surface. By using different brushes, you can gain different effects. I like to use this technique to make crisp shapes and lines. Layering is very important in a watercolour piece. This is done as the painting progresses, but here I'll show you how to do it on a smaller scale. You can incorporate all of the techniques into this one, but here's what's important. The bottom layer must be dry before adding the next. When adding a layer of paint that's the same colour as the bottom one, it'll darken, and if you're using a different colour, it'll blend into a new colour. Remember how yellow and blue will make green if you mix them together? It works a bit like that. I like to use layers to build shape, colour and tone. The reason brushes are different shapes is because when they are used they make different shapes, which is obvious. But these brushes also give different marks based on how you hold them. The round brush, for example, is very versatile. When held at a horizontal angle and pulled sideways, it can make broad strokes. and if you pull it diagonally, thinner strokes. You could also get thinner strokes if you hold the brush vertically. The flat brush can create a similar mark to the broad marks of a round brush, however it's more consistent. Using the flat side, you'll always end up with the same shape stroke, while using it on its side gives thinner lines. The pinstripe brush can also make broad lines, however I don't recommend using it for this type of mark often. It could bend the bristles out of shape. This brush is best used for making long, thin lines or teeny tiny marks. The calligraphy brush is very versatile. Due to how thick it is while having such a narrow taper, you can make almost any mark with it. Thin lines, thick lines, it can do it all. However, it's not an easy brush to learn. One benefit of the calligraphy brush is that it holds a heck of a lot of water. And by that it means, for me, it can hold it a little bit too much water sometimes and actually drip further down the page than I intended it to. But what that means is that for larger pieces, it works great for me. Because that means I can just keep going and going and not have to worry too much about if I'm going to run out of paint or not. Next, I'll show you how to do a flat wash. You need enough watercolour in the palette to be able to cover the area you want with flat colour. Then you need to use your brush, and without going back and painting over what you just did, or it'll have the same effect as layering does, pull colour from one side to the other. I like to use an up and down motion for this. If you feel like you're running out of product on your brush, then go get some more from the palette. Just don't let the paint on the page dry if you're not finished yet. I made a small mistake when I added more paint to my page. I worked back over what I had already done. Luckily, because it was still wet, I was able to pull it in the correct direction and save it. This technique is mostly used for covering large areas with one colour. I'm using the round brush again here, but if I were to cover a large space, then I would use either a flat brush or my calligraphy brush. Creating a gradient is very similar to doing a wash. This time though, we will add more pigment to the end and dilute it with water as we press down the shape. We want there to be little to no colour near where we want the other colour to join. If you're doing a dark to light gradient, you can stop here. Since I'm going to use another colour, I'm going to do the same as before, but starting at the other end of the shape. When we get closer to the middle, we're going to use water and a little bit of colour to mix in the middle. I recommend doing this while the paint's still wet. This way the colours will mix correctly. It's a bit of back and forth using two colours. Just keep working at it until you're happy. That's all for the basics of understanding mark making. There are other types of brushes and techniques, but I'll show you those in a second video. Now I'll show you how you can put these techniques to use in a painting. I'll be painting a hydrangea. I have altered its proportions so that you can more easily see what I'm doing. After sketching out what I'll be drawing, I'm going to wet the area around the flower heads. Next, I'll be using the wet on wet technique to add a light amount of colour. This will be the lightest colour, so you don't need that much pigment. You don't have to, but I like to add a little bit more colour towards the bottom of it, just to make it look a bit rounder. I'm using the same technique on the stem and leaves, and keeping in mind the curve of the leaves and making sure that the shading stays towards the bottom of each leaf. And now we need to wait for it to dry. Now I'm going to pick up a slightly darker colour, and I'm going to be using the wet on dry technique with the round brush to colour in where I want my darker shadows to be. I'm doing this now despite knowing I'll have to darken it more later to help me focus on the flowers. Can you see how they're standing out now? I decided I wanted it a little darker before moving to the next part. I'm doing this now so I don't get too confused when shading in the flowers. Once it's dried, add more water to the colour you're using and add in some darker shapes in the middle of each flower and underneath where the petals overlap. Don't make it too dark, just enough so that you can notice a difference. I can see that some of these shapes are a little harsh. I'll add some clean water to my brush and feather them out using the gradient technique. Now I'm moving back to the stem and leaves. Using the side of my round brush and a dark green, I'm picking out the shapes in the leaves. Leaves will have lobes and veins, and they are often lighter in colour to the rest of the leaf, so I want to avoid those areas. For areas that are a little difficult, use the tip of your brush instead of the side of it. I am also going to use the same green to darken the top and bottom of the stem. I'm using a little bit of clean water on my brush to create a gradient from the two greens, so it's lighter in the middle. This can give an illusion that the stem is curved. You can see that I'm adding more of the same green paint to it. Here I'm layering to build depth to the leaf, keeping my focus on areas I want to be darker. I'm also mixing my paints to achieve some variety in the colour. Back to the flowers. Using the same colour you had been for the flowers, go over the underside of the petals and in the middle. This time we're not going to be blending it. This is what gives the flowers form. What we are essentially doing is creating shadows that the flowers would be casting on themselves. This is what makes it look like a 3D object. After adding shadows to the petals, I noticed they were beginning to blend in with the inner shadow again. This time, when I added paint, I made sure it was very pigmented, as I wanted this to be the darkest area. I'm also using this as an opportunity to clean up any petals that look a bit rough. I'm using my pinstripe brush to define areas where the petals overlap. We've done this before with a brown brush, but this time I'm using a bit more pigment in my brush. I'm also making much thinner lines this time. I don't want to outline the flowers, I'm only adding the petals' darkest areas. Using the pinstripe brush allows me to make the thinnest lines that I need. If you feel as though the paint that you've put down is a little darker than you'd actually like it to be, then you can take a clean piece of tissue paper and just dab a little bit of it off. This is the final push to make these flowers really stand out. It's what picks out the petals as individual parts of the flower instead of it being one large shape. And now we move back to the leaves for the final time. The first thing I do is use a bit of yellow on my flat brush and lightly go over where the top curve of the leaves should be. For my leaves, it's on the very upper edge and midway through the bottom half of the leaves. I also decided to add the same yellow to the middle vein of the leaf because I wanted it to be vibrant. Using the pinstripe brush, I am adding a dark green to the left side of the stem. I am also using the same green to define the edges of the leaf shape. I am being very light with my lines as I want these to subtly bring forth the leaves from the page. I do the same with a light yellow-green on the upper half of the leaf. Using the dark green here would make the leaves look strange. By adding the lighter colour, we can still define the leaf shape while adding a subtle highlight. And that's the end! Thank you for watching this video all the way through. I hope I was able to teach you something new today. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. Goodbye!